Hello everyone, this is John and I have some exciting Japanese maple topics for you today. We're going to first of all talk about how and when to prune and shape your young Japanese maple trees when they're just a few years old. We're also going to talk about fertilizing Japanese maple trees. I'm going to talk about what I personally do when I fertilize, what I fertilize with, and then we're going to give some updates on the cuttings that we did in the last video, some of the seedlings that we planted and some of the other seedlings that I've planted this season, and then also an update on the color variation that I'm getting with my garden. So stick around and I'll dive into all these great topics. In one of my recent videos, someone asked about when to prune and when to trim young Japanese maple trees. And so right now I want to take just a moment and to kind of talk you through the process that I go through when it comes to trimming young Japanese maple seedlings. So as you can see here, these particular ones are somewhere between 3 and 4 years old. So these are a little bit older. You can see here that they actually have quite thick stems, maybe somewhere around 1/4 of an inch thick. They're getting pretty thick, but one of the general rules of thumb is you don't want to do a lot of trimming of young Japanese maples trees. No drastic pruning, because a lot of these branches that maybe seem like they're kind of flimsy and weak will strengthen over time and become good branches. Basically at this stage, what you're wanting to do is you're wanting to trim off any of these little branches really down here that are going to be way lower than you want the tree to be. So, you know, you look at a normal tree, you want to have a clear trunk and you want to have branches out here. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to take these 4 examples that I have here and I'm going to go through and do a basic pruning and kind of talk you through what I do here. Once again, these are 3 to 4 years old, so I've waited till they're a little bit older, and then I'm only going to trim off the lower portions. I'm not going to do a lot of shaping up here just yet. That'll happen in the next few years as the tree starts to kind of develop and as we see how the branches are thickening up and just how the growth pattern is going. One of the first things you want to do, and this is always a good practice when you're trimming your Japanese maples or really any tree, is you want to go ahead and sanitize your shears. So I have some nice shears here, and I'm going to go ahead and take an alcohol pad and I'm going to go ahead and sanitize this. Make sure there's no viruses, bacteria, fungus, other things that could get on this Japanese maple and get it sick. You know, the chances of that happening are somewhat low, and this is not going to be completely sterile, but it's never a bad idea. It just takes a couple extra seconds, and it could save you from problems in the future. Okay, so once again, as you can see here, this is a good, healthy Japanese maple 3 to 4 year old tree. It started 3 to 4 years ago, just like this, basically here. And in just a few years, it's grown to this size. So it's definitely, Japanese maple trees grow somewhat slowly, but they're rewarding when you stick with them. Okay, so you can see here, these lower branches, I'm gonna go ahead and snip those off. Nothing fancy, just snipping them off right there where they connect. You can also see that there's some here. I don't want that forming. And I'm going to go ahead and take off this one lower one here. So now you can see here, we have a pretty good clear trunk. You know, at some point in the future, there may be more trimming that needs to be done. And, you know, there'll be some shaping, maybe next year, or maybe 2 years from now. This will start, when this gets potted up to a bigger pot, then I'll start shaping it more into what I want there. But that one looks pretty good to me. So now I'm going to move to a next one and show you a different growth pattern. So this tree is about the same age, and I don't know if you can see the very top here, but this is very tall. This particular one has grown very tall and put most of its growth straight up instead of out. You notice this one grew a little more out. This particular one's going straight up. But nonetheless, once again, here at the bottom, I have these branches going out, and I'm not going to want this. What I want from this tree is I'm going to want this to kind of get thicker. I'm going to want some of these branches to branch out and create a fuller tree here, but I don't want these branches clear down here. So I'm going to go ahead and trim those now so the tree doesn't spend a lot of time strengthening these branches, because these are not going to be where I want them to be. So once again, just taking this, trimming that off. Just real basic. This isn't rocket science at this point. There's a little more art to trimming your Japanese maples later on as they get older, but right now it's not too bad. Okay, here's another example of a Japanese maple tree. This one it even has a little bit of a thicker stem. This one I don't need to do a lot of trimming. As you can see here, there's just a little bit of leaves growing up there. So I'm gonna go ahead and trim those off. This one I'm actually gonna repot too. I'll do that in just a minute. I can see that this one it doesn't have a lot of depth of soil. That's kind of washed out a little bit. And this is really getting too small for this in my particular opinion. Obviously, as I've mentioned in the past, I'm very aggressive at how I pot these up. Now, this one's a teeny bit thicker, and so I might look through this and maybe trim off one or two small branches up above that I'm not liking. For instance, this one in here, there's one in here. Maybe, I don't know if you can see that very well, but there's one in here that's growing that way into this other branch. I'm going to go ahead and trim that off and just do a very, very light pruning and shaping of this one as it is getting a teeny bit older. This particular branch is growing right up into that branch. I'm going to go ahead and trim that off. And once again, I'm not going to do anything heavy. I think that's good for now. Pretty simple. We'll pot that one up a little bit more in a second. Here's one of the last trees. Once again, 3 to 4 years old. This one could probably be potted up as well, so I'll probably pot this one up in just a minute as well. This one actually looks pretty good. It looks like, honestly, you know, I thought I was going to have to trim this one a little bit, but the more I look at this, I think I'm actually pretty good with that. This particular branch here may eventually get trimmed off. If you deleted that one out, that may actually have a little better shape. But for now, as I'm letting this tree develop, I think it looks kind of balanced with this little smaller branch. So I'm going to go ahead and actually leave that for now. So now let's go ahead and I'm going to pot these two up. And then I want to transition over to fertilizing Japanese maples. I'm going to talk about which fertilizer that I use. I want to talk about the timing and when you go about that. Okay, I'm going to put my gloves on here. We'll start with this one. We'll pot this particular tree up. This is a beautiful tree. I really love that it has a little bit of a like feathery look to the leaves. It maintains a nice reddish color throughout a lot of the season. And it's a good tree that I really want to grow up to be a good, healthy tree. So once again, I pot up very, very aggressively so that this tree can stay healthy and not get root bound. So I have the next step up pot that we're going to go ahead and put that in. First of all, I'm going to put some soil at the bottom of it, and then I'll place that in, and then we'll do the second one. When it comes to which potting soil I use, doesn't matter too much which potting soil you use. I use G&B Organics potting soil. That's what I prefer, but it really doesn't matter too much what you use. Just a good all-purpose potting soil. I choose organic because I think it's best, but choose what you want there. It's not too specific, but just a good potting soil will work. So I'm going to go ahead and take this out, coax this out of the pot. You can see that the root system has developed pretty good there. It's not root bound or anything like that. There's actually an earthworm right there. That's pretty cool. But this is a good time to go ahead and pot this. I have this pot somewhere around half full. I'm going to go ahead and kind of tease the roots just slightly. Stick that down in that. And then go and put the soil back in it. Okay, there's that one. Should be much happier in this bigger pot. And it should have a little bit more room to grow its roots. It's just going to be a lot happier in that pot, so that one's good. Once again, this is a beautiful specimen tree, hopefully a specimen tree when it gets older, one that I love to plant out in the landscape at some point in the next several years. So beautiful tree. Let's move on to the next one. So here's the next one. This one, pretty standard looking Japanese maple. It's got a nice red color. It looks very similar to like the Bloodgood variety, which I believe is probably where these seeds came from. Very likely. But but you know, just a good healthy tree. This one might even be one I use to graft in the future, but either way, I want this to have a better root system than this small little pot can afford. So let's go ahead and pot this up to the next big large pot as well. So once again, here we have this larger pot. I'm gonna go ahead and fill this about halfway like we did with the previous one, so we can get this going. Okay, that's about half full. Now we're gonna go ahead and get this one out of its pot and put it in its new home. This one actually got a little drier than I normally like. It's kind of at the end of my yard near the fence. And we had some rain come through, but apparently that didn't get wet enough. And it's a little drier than I like, but it is pretty root bound. As you can see here, this is definitely due for a repotting, and it's filled this pot quite well. This larger pot will also help it retain more moisture, which is going to be beneficial. The smaller pots for a root bound tree like this are not going to be good. So I'm going to tease these roots just a little bit. Once again, there's some earthworms in there, which is obviously a good sign. Get that teased a little bit, stick that down in the new pot, and then go ahead and fill this in with soil. Okay, there we have it. I probably have some more that I'm going to pot up in the coming weeks, and so I need to get some more potting soil and do that. But you know, when you're growing your Japanese maples, you can pot them up as you will, but my recommendation is just take a look at it as it gets thicker, and as you can see that it's definitely outgrowing its pot. Be very aggressive with your potting up of your Japanese maples. You're going to have a healthier, happier tree in the long run if you do that. Okay, now let's move over to fertilization. When do you fertilize Japanese maple trees, and how often? And I want to talk about some do's and don'ts, and also what particular fertilizers to look for and to use with Japanese maples. First of all, I want to talk about which fertilizer that I actually use on my Japanese maples. I personally use a G&B Organics Rhododendron Azalea and Camellia fertilizer. This particular fertilizer is good because it has a good balance of the NPK ratio here. So as you can see here, the NPK ratio of this particular fertilizer is a 4-5-2. In this particular fertilizer, 4 is N for nitrogen, 5 is P for phosphorus, and 2 is K for potassium. So what this represents is the percentage of each of these ingredients that is in this particular fertilizer. Once again, that first number 4 means that this particular fertilizer is 4% nitrogen. A lower nitrogen like that is important for Japanese maple trees because you don't want them to get really fast growth that gets real leggy, and you don't want them to grow abnormally quick, because Japanese maples are slow growing trees, and you want to promote that naturally. So this once again has worked well for me. I'm sure there are other brands out there of similar fertilizer that you can use, but once again, you want to look for a balanced fertilizer with that lower nitrogen number. There are specific Japanese maple fertilizers that I've seen like on Amazon, but you usually overpay for something like that. It's really not necessary. It's probably actually very similar or exact same formula as what this is. Okay, now let's talk about when and how often you fertilize your Japanese maples. Now, when it comes to the timing, what time of year and how often you should fertilize your Japanese maple trees, I personally, based on my personal experience, have found that if you fertilize one time a year, right after your last frost for the season, so, you know, in the spring after your last frost has passed, then you're going to promote growth that's not going to get damaged by a late cold snap. This particular year, this year, I fertilized just a little too early, and I promoted some growth on a few of these trees, especially the bigger ones. And we had a kind of a later frost that I didn't expect, pretty cold snap, and there was a little bit of damage, cold damage on some of the trees. But you can eliminate a lot of that by fertilizing right after your last frost. Now, if you don't know what your last frost dates are for your area, you can just simply go online, Google last frost dates with your zip code, and you should find an indicator of when some of your last estimated frost dates are. You also want to make sure that you don't fertilize it too late in the season. Let's say that you want to fertilize, you know, in the middle of the summer. You forgot to do it in the spring and you want to do it in the middle of summer. Early summer, you're going to be totally fine. But you don't want to fertilize late into the fall because, once again, the same problem that you might have by fertilizing too early, getting some damage, some winter weather damage. If you fertilize too late in the fall, you're going to promote a bunch of growth near the end of the season, and then your first frost might actually damage that tree. So once again, just to recap that, fertilize, my recommendation, what I personally do is I fertilize once a year. I like to fertilize, and a good general rule is to fertilize right after your last frost for the season, and fertilize trees that are somewhere between 1.5 to 2 years old and on. Don't fertilize trees that are too young. It's not really necessary, so once again, you're wasting fertilizer, and you possibly might damage the tree. I don't know. I haven't done it personally, but I'm imagining that it could be too strong for the roots. But either way, it's not necessary. Don't do it with the younger trees. Do it with your older trees. Now I want to go over and give an update with the cuttings that we did in the last video, and also the seedlings that we planted as well. And I want to talk about how those are doing. Okay, here's the clear tote that we used in the past video to store these cuttings in. And as you can see here, it's right under this maple table bench that I built. So it's not getting direct sunlight. It's only getting filtered light and indirect sunlight. So that's important to keep cuttings from getting fried by too much light, too much sun. Light is important, but not too much light here. Now, when it comes to taking care of these on a daily basis, twice a day you want to take a spray bottle, something like this, and you just want to mist these leaves and make sure that they stay nice and moist. You might have to periodically keep the soil medium wet as well, as it gets warmer in the season especially. And when it comes to success rate, as you can see, there are quite a few less in here than when we did the cuttings and put these in here. The ones that have done the best so far have been the Alarians. I have the most of those that still look viable. The Orangiolas, we still have several of those that look viable. When it comes to the Alpenweiss, I at least have this one that might make it, and there's a couple others, 2 there and maybe 1 there, that still have the potential to make it. Several of the other ones I have pulled out because they've died and they've turned brown. The Amber Ghost, that one, as I mentioned when I did the video, that particular tree actually had some damage from the later frost, and so it got really cold for a couple nights, and it had put on a lot of new growth, and it damaged the leaves. So the leaves weren't looking the best. They weren't looking as good as they normally would that time of year. So those particular cuttings have failed. You know that a cutting has failed when you can see, for instance, this has just turned into a brown stick. And so there's no life left in that. That's not gonna root into anything. So I'm gonna go ahead and take that out. That one has failed. Last year I used a little bit different method. I used a regular propagation tray and I tinted plastic over it. And I did have some success with Amber Ghost, with Bloodgood, and also with the Alpenweiss variety. I did have a few of those actually root. This year I'm hoping to, it looks like, get Alarians to root and the Orangiolas. And if I can get a few of those, that would be great. Obviously, I'm not having a perfect success rate. This hasn't been perfect. There are a lot of factors that can affect your success rate. It was a little colder early on in the season. I started this about 2 weeks earlier than last year. Nonetheless, I think I'm still going to have some viable cuttings here. And you know, if you don't have the perfect environment and on a greenhouse environment, a controlled environment, you know, you can probably expect somewhere less than a 50% success rate, probably somewhere around 25% or maybe slightly lower. And it looks like that's probably what I'll get this year. If I can get somewhere between 5 and 6 or 7 of these to root, I'll feel like it's definitely worth it. And I'll improve the process and tweak this process a little bit till I can get a higher success rate. So that's how they're doing, and that's the update on the cuttings. So here are 4 different flats of Japanese maples that I've planted up this year. I've actually done a couple more, but just want to cover these 4. So you can see here, overall, trees are looking pretty decent. I had these not under a shade cloth for the early part of the season. I have now put them under a shade cloth to make sure that they don't get sun scorched, especially important when they're this young. And really, Japanese maples in general should not be kept in really bright, hot summer sun. That's going to not be good for them. You can see that not 100% successful. This particular one here is pretty much dead. I can go and eliminate that one. I don't know, maybe there's a little life left in it. I may give that a little time, but that looks like that's probably going to die. It's lost its leaves. It's not looking so good. Here's one here. Got crispy and didn't make it. But in general, as you can see, most of these are doing totally fine. These will start putting on new growth like this one in the coming weeks and start growing up. But as you can see, it's working out pretty well. I want to move over now and show you just how different Japanese maple trees, the seedlings, once again, they're not true to their mother plant. They do have variations, genetic variations, and so different colors, different leaf shapes, as I've shown in the past. And so I want to show you how the leaves have changed, even over the past month and a half or so, and what they're looking like now, how some of them have formed a lot of green, how there are some that kind of have a green and red mix, and show you what those seedlings look like now. So just about a month ago, I showed you what these Japanese maple seedlings were looking like. Once again, these are the 2-year or so old on to 3-year-old or so Japanese maple seedlings that I have under a shade cloth here on this bench that I've built. And as you can see, there are a lot more greens developing in some of these trees. So, you know, Japanese maple seedlings, when you grow them from seed, once again, there's going to be a lot of genetic variation that happens with these trees. They're not going to be exactly the same as the mother plant because they're going to be cross-pollinated. But you're going to get a lot of unique colors, shapes, and you know, some of them will stay red for a lot of the season, like similar to a blood good variety, but a lot of them will turn green throughout the season. Those are going to be often good candidates for grafting in the future if they're not particularly spectacular, pretty standard looking kind of green. That might make for a good grafting tree in the future. But you're also going to get some really unique, great varieties as well. So I want to pull a few, once again, a few examples from this particular section of my Japanese maple collection. Some of the ones that I think that are looking so beautiful right now from this particular area, and show you some of the unique colors and variations this time of year that I'm getting. So here are a few examples from that section of my collection, once again, that I want to show you just some of the variation and how these have developed in color and shape. I think these are always fun to look at. So first of all, as you see this one here, some of the newer growth has beautiful red to it, but as the tree leaves develop, they turn a lot more green, but they actually have a very feathery shape on these palmate leaves. So that's a very beautiful tree. This particular example, this did this last year as well, and so this is looking pretty good. But as you can see, this one actually has a cool variation where it starts out pretty red at the beginning of the year, and then as it starts fading into its green, it gets kind of spotty. Gets little spots of red mixed in with the green, and you actually get kind of almost looks like a rusty color. It's kind of neat. It's kind of a red rusty color, and with the green on the edges. It's kind of a cool, almost variegation. It's not exactly a variegation, but it's kind of a variegated look, at least this point in the year. So that one's really neat to look at. This one, once again, it has a little bit of a feathery look, but it's a little of a wider leaf. And this one also, as it's switching to green, it kind of gets red splotches, which are kind of fun to look at as the red kind of fades. So that's kind of a neat variation. I showed this one last time, but I really love this one. It looks a lot like the other lace leaf varieties, so you can definitely see the genetics there. It's green, but it's a nice lace leaf. And it has a very slow, low growth pattern, so this will probably be a tree that doesn't grow very large. And it'll probably be one that grows like a lot of the lace leaf varieties where it kind of drapes over and weeps over. So that'll probably be what that tree becomes in the future. This one is just a pretty standard looking tree that stays red for a lot of the season. This one here is a great tree. It, once again, will stay red for a good part of the season. You can see some green coming out, but it's got a lot more of a feathery look to the leaf. That one's great. This one is even darker, and it's red, and with a feathery look there to its leaf. Here's another good standard one that's sort of like a blood good. Nice lighter new growth, lighter red, and as it develops it becomes more of a dark burgundy red. And then this particular one, once again, this one has a good amount of color variation. So it's got a lot of red, kind of a lighter red, but then it's got little splotches of green around the edges and around the middle. And so it's kind of got a variegated look, at least this point in the year. This is definitely a tree to watch and to pay attention to, because this actually could be one of my favorite trees in the collection if it continues to do this and continues to grow like this and continues to exhibit these kind of color characteristics. So, you know, it's just fun to look at these Japanese maple trees and to see the different variation in them. I did want to let you guys know that I plan to do a Q&A video in the future. So if you have a question for me about Japanese maples, go ahead and leave that in the comments section below. And I'm going to, in the coming future, go ahead and record a Q&A video where I'm going to answer your questions based on what questions you have about Japanese maples, growing Japanese maples. I can, you know, answer from my experience and hopefully help you with some of the things that you bring up. So do leave that in the comment section below and look forward to seeing that video in the future. Well, I hope this video was helpful for you and that you learned from it. If you're not yet subscribed to the channel, please consider subscribing. And if you did enjoy the video, please also consider clicking that like button. Until next time, thank you for watching.